All right, so you may have seen my other video about how, why, and what you'll need to get started in small engine repair, where I basically said the vast majority of small engine repair problems are fuel related. And so with a can of carb cleaner and some basic torques and tools and ways to clean out carburetors, you'll be on your way. And so I hope that was helpful for someone. What I want to talk about today is maybe you watched that video and you said, yeah, I've been there, done that, or you want to, let's say, move to the quote unquote next level, being able to do more engine repairs that right now you can't, or maybe you want to get faster at doing what you're already doing. And so this is going to be basically part 2 to tell you what you might purchase to speed up your game or to increase the capacity of what you can work on. So the first thing I'll say, which I ended the last video with, was buying a small impact driver that has one of these quick release hexes on the end that take any bit like this. There is a difference between an impact driver and just what they call like a drill driver. They make guns like this that have a shank like this, but they don't hammer. They just twist like a drill. And those are not quite as handy. What is nice about these is you can get really, actually let me use a different bit, you can get quite controlled with them, where you can just move this very slow, just one little hammer at a time. And of course you can use this to cross thread and strip things, but you have quite a lot of control with this. And not only does this speed up all of the times you use torques and Phillips, but you can pick up these. They're kind of tricky to find on Amazon. I'll have to put a link. But you can pick up these. So you get 10 and 8 millimeter that goes right in the shank, so you don't have to deal with adapters. And that's not just for convenience. Sometimes if you have an adapter, then as you pull it out of the crevice that you had it in, the socket stays back, and then you have to get a magnet and pull it out. But anyway, so that's a big one. The next thing I'd suggest is maybe just getting a few more brushes. So you can buy a kit like this on Amazon. If you Google blowtorch tip cleaner, you normally get this as a bundle, and these are pretty handy. Basically this little guy can do almost everything that these can do. It just takes a little longer because it's the wrong diameter. But these are pretty handy for the larger passageways that you need to get clean. And I don't know if you can get these separately, but they come with that blue thing. This is a really useful brush. I looked all over for these. I use this by hand, but I also can throw this in a drill and get into little crevices in the carburetor, specifically the bowls that are otherwise difficult to find. And at the end of the video, I'll show you exactly what this is called, so you can find it on Amazon because it's tricky to search for. The next thing that will just make your life a little bit easier is if you go to like a local Ace Hardware. Tygon is the company that makes high-end fuel line. And there is a big difference between the high-end fuel line and the cheap stuff that comes in these carburetor kits that you get from Amazon. And what you want to do is maybe pick up, you can buy by the foot normally, buy a couple feet of each size. This size in particular is the one that I use most often, and because my memory sucks. So 0.18 or 4.7 millimeter, something like that, 4.8 millimeter. This is the one you'll use most often, but there's a thicker one and a thinner one that you'll use less often. But instead of ordering a carb kit or something like that, I recommend just grabbing a couple feet of this stuff and get the good stuff. It's worth it. You won't have comebacks. It's easier to slip it through the fuel tanks. It's easier to work with. It's more pliable and it's more professional. Okay, next thing is every once in a while, you're gonna come across an ignition coil that is weak. And if you're used to taking the spark plug out of the engine and putting the coil wire on it, and then having this touch the engine ground and pull the engine over, and you look for a little spark there, you're gonna come across a coil that can do that, but it can't do it under compression. And you're gonna get fooled and stumped, and you're gonna be really frustrated. So in case that doesn't make sense to you, let me just explain it. The coil's job is to create a high enough voltage to jump the gap between the center electrode and the finger. Okay, when you're doing this in atmospheric pressure, there's basically 14.7 psi of air in between that gap. But when you put this in an engine and you pull it, the air is compressed. And so there's a larger quantity or a higher density of air in between there. And a weak coil is able to jump the gap at atmospheric pressure, but not under compression. And so that's nothing you're ever going to be able to see. And so that's where a tester like this comes in, where, now this is for automotive, this is for cars. So you have to adjust the range here. But what you'll find is that you may look at this and say, oh, that's an itty bitty tiny gap. Why do I need more than that? Well, you need more than that because, again, under compression, it's harder to jump that. And so this tester allows you to see if the coil can jump a big gap at atmospheric pressure, which corresponds to a tiny gap under compression. And so these numbers correspond to, I think, kilovolts, if I remember correctly. Anyway, I can't remember. Don't quote me on that. But anyway, look up a spark tester. There's lots of different types. This one's really old and the alligator clip's even broken. But every once in a while, you're going to get stumped by a coil that arcs this at atmospheric pressure, but not under compression. Okay, speaking of compression, a small compression gauge like this is a good choice. Basically, you thread this into where the spark plug goes. You reset it by pushing on that little Schrader valve inside, and then you give it a few pulls and you check to see what your compression is. They normally come with a couple of adapters, so you can use it on different holes. Now, if you read around, you will find guys saying that the longer, bigger gauge compression gauge that are used for automotive engines won't work on small engines because they skew the readings. And they justify this by saying the small engine puts out such a small amount of air that it has to fill this long hose and move this big needle, and so it gives false readings. I have automotive gauges, and I've done a few, not many, but I've done a few side-by-side comparisons, and this gauge gives the same results as my big gauge. So there are some smart guys on the forums that I really respect who claim it makes a difference, and frankly, I believe them, but I've done a few tests and it didn't make a difference for me. And so I would not say that an automotive gauge is useless. I would just say it can make a difference, and so be careful. Okay, speaking of spark plug holes, you may consider buying this adapter. This threads into most spark plug holes, and you can also typically use these adapters if you need to get a different spark plug hole. And what that does is it allows you to hook up a hose from the end of a vacuum pump or a pressure pump. And then if you remove the air filter and the carburetor and the muffler, you can install these custom-made plates that you're going to have to make or buy. And you cut some rubber inner tubing from like a bike tire, and you block off the intake and you block off the exhaust, and you fill the you fill the engine with compressed air, and you see if it's leaking anywhere. Now, this is only done on a two-stroke. Chainsaws, weed whackers, leaf blowers, that kind of thing. And if you ever hear somebody talk about a two-stroke air leak, it's generally found by pressurizing the crankcase and looking for air leaking out with soapy water, or putting it in a bath underwater. Or you can have seals that don't leak when it's under pressure, but they leak under vacuum. So you normally do a vacuum check and a pressure check. And I'm not about to go into all the details on that. I've only air leaked probably 30 engines, but I've probably worked on like 500. So I don't use it that often, and I'm actually not an expert. Some guys are really specific about doing the vacuum before the pressure, or the pressure before the vacuum. Some guys are really specific about how many PSI and for how long, and I don't want to start an argument or mislead anyone. But what I will say is, if everything I've said so far is like, yeah, I've been there, done that, then, and you're not pressure testing saws, every once in a while, you're gonna have a saw that has an air leak or a weed whacker or something like that, and you're gonna just beat your head against the wall. And so you need to block off the intake, block off the exhaust, and you'll have to make some of these plates. Thicker aluminum's nice because it drills quickly. You can see this is for a pool and carb and a pool and exhaust, and a Husqvarna 50 carb, and then you have to basically block them off. It's kind of a pain in the butt because it's a lot of customization, and sometimes your rubber gasket doesn't seal, and so it leaks back out of your port, and it can be a real pain, but there are some problems that can only be found in that way. Now, the other thing that you can use a vacuum pressure gauge for is pressure and vacuum testing carburetors. So on a carb, the fuel line that goes in, if the carb is wet, so this does not work on a brand new carb that has never seen fuel, but you can pressurize or pull a vacuum on this. And if the metering needle, which is moved by the metering diaphragm, is leaking, it'll show up in this test. And again, I'm not going to get into all the details right now of how many PSI and how long it has to hold. It's not exactly my area of expertise, but I have found bad carbs this way, and when you're really beating your head against a wall, this can reveal a problem. Okay, another thing you may want is some sort of multimeter. It doesn't have to be this good of one. This is one I bought when I was an automotive tech. It can be a much simpler one, something that does DC and AC volts, resistance. That would be fine. You very rarely are you going to have to measure amperage or diodes, but doing a continuity test or a resistance test and measuring voltage is almost, I'm not even sure if there's a digital meter out there that won't do those things. So basically any digital meter will be fine. And I would say this is mainly used if you're working on like lawn tractors, like a riding lawnmower, for checking the signal from the clutch switch and the seat switch and the PTO switch and voltage drop on the starter cable and things like that. If you're only working on handheld things like weed whackers and chainsaws, I don't think I've ever used this on a little two-stroke, but on the machines that have batteries and starters and alternators, stuff like that, at some point you're going to need this. So one tool I would not recommend buying is an ultrasonic cleaner. I know there's a place for these, and I know that guys love them, but here's my suggestion. If you're doing small residential machines that cost $250, something like that, a customer is not going to want to pay you an extensive amount of time to clean their carburetor. If the carburetor is so corroded or so messed up that you can't clean it with brushes and carb spray, is probably best to replace it. And sometimes you can buy an OEM carb for relatively cheap, 20 to 40 bucks. Sometimes they're a little bit cost prohibitive for a customer who owns a homeowner grade chainsaw. And so on Amazon or eBay, you can buy basically Chinesium knockoffs. And although they're not great, for the customer who spent $200 on a weed whacker, again, they don't want to buy a $90 carburetor. So they're happy with the $10, $15 carburetor, and it'll get them running and moving. So my experience has been that there are carbs that are easy to clean with carb spray and brushes, and you don't need this. Then there are carbs that are so far gone that hours and hours in this thing still don't make it right, and you end up replacing it. There are some folks on the forums who will argue that these ultrasonic cleaners don't work unless you spend about $1,000 on a super good one. Then there are people who swear by these things. When I've read those debates and discussions, what I've personally noticed is that the people who swear by them don't really have a lot of proof that they've worked. They just like how clean the outside of the carburetor. They always say like, oh, it gets the outside of the carburetor nice and shiny. Well, the outside of the carburetor doesn't matter, and you can do that with hot soapy water. And what you really need an ultrasonic cleaner for is cleaning out the passageways that you can't get to with brushes. Again, in my experience, if you have major problems in there, a week in this thing won't fix it. All right, the last thing I'll mention is what I also mentioned last time, is just building up for yourself a little assortment of common parts. The most common parts I replace are fuel filters, primer bulbs, and the 4 different types of metering diaphragm gaskets. These gaskets are about 25 cents a piece if you buy them in bulk off Amazon, and that's the most common thing that goes wrong in carburetors, is those things get brittle. So last thing I'll do is take you over to the computer. I know this is low tech, I'm sorry. If you're gonna buy a compression gauge, I would highly recommend that you start taking notes on what machine you worked on, what was the problem, and what compression you got. The reason being is You can't always find the compression specifications for an engine. The other thing is, just give you a simple example. Let's say the compression is supposed to be 150 PSI and it's 145 PSI, 5 PSI low. If you're a new mechanic, you don't know if that means there's a problem or not. I can tell you that if it's supposed to be 150 and it's 145, that's not going to keep an engine from starting, but you may not know that yet. And so you have to learn not only what the specifications are, but what the tolerance is. When we say 150, at what point do you really start having symptoms and problems? It's not at 145 PSI. It definitely is at 100 PSI. And you need to learn that. And the best way to learn that is to build for yourself your own little database of machines you've worked on and the compression ratings that you had. Standardize your process, install the compression gauge, give it 3 hard pulls, and then make your mark. The other thing I used to do is I used to document the compression at 1 pull and then the compression at 3 pulls because that was interesting to me. But make yourself a list. All right, anyway, last thing. So here's where you can find those brushes. Again, it's hard to find these things when you don't really know what to look for, but that's how you can find those little brushes I was telling you about. This is something I forgot to talk about, but these are little tiny cans that you can keep gasoline or lacquer thinner in. Sorry, I meant to have this already. These are really handy. I have 2. And this is nice for keeping gasoline around, which is a great solvent when you're cleaning carbs. And it also has this little basket, so you can put stuff in there, let it soak, and then pull it back out. These are super handy. Get the large, not the small. This is a large here. You can see how big it is next to my hand. And then, let's see, the last thing I was going to show you, the ultrasonic cleaner. Oh yeah. So again, I wouldn't recommend that. If you already own everything I've shown today and you're looking to spend money and you're looking to be the guy who can fix that really rare carb from an old, outdated steel chainsaw that you can't get a reasonably priced replacement carb for, that's fine, go for it. I mean, I've worked on some saws from the 60s and yeah, those super hard to find expensive carbs, it's worth trying to clean them. But for the most part, the average Joe, just replace the carb if you get to the point where you can't clean it with brushes. Okay, well, I hope that was helpful for someone. If not, let me know by giving me a thumbs down and go check out a guy from England. His channel name is The Repair Specialist. Really cool guy, puts a lot of effort into his videos, and he's definitely got the gift of teaching. He loves teaching you about the inner workings of carburetors. The Repair Specialist, he's awesome. Go check him out. Take care, y'all.